Good morning. I want to begin today not with a chart, not with a forecast, and not with a revised projection from the Congressional Budget Office. I want to begin with a single number that, in my professional assessment, represents one of the most significant and underreported economic developments in North American trade history over the past 12 months. $22 billion. That is the estimated value of American produced consumer goods that Canadian households have deliberately, systematically, and I must emphasize this word, permanently redirected away from U.S. suppliers over the course of the past year. Not temporarily, not experimentally, permanently. And when I use that word in an economic context, I use it with the full weight of what it implies for supply chain architecture, for brand equity depreciation, for long run export revenue modeling, and for the bilateral trade relationship that has, for decades, been the single largest and most deeply integrated commercial partnership on the face of this earth. I have spent the better part of my professional life at the Federal Reserve, at the Council of Economic Advisors, and at the Treasury Department, studying how consumer behavior shifts in response to macroeconomic shocks. I have watched inflation reshape purchasing patterns. I have watched interest rate cycles cool demand and reignite it. I have watched recessions carve permanent scars into household balance sheets that took a full generation to heal. But what I am observing in the Canadian consumer market right now is something that does not fit neatly into any of those historical templates. What is happening north of the 49th parallel is not a cyclical adjustment. It is not a temporary emotional response to political tension. What is happening is a structural reorientation of consumer loyalty at a scale and speed that, frankly, we did not model for. And that failure to model for it is something the United States economy is going to feel, not next quarter, not next year, but across the next decade of trade negotiations, export revenue projections, and brand level market share calculations. Let me be precise about the historical context, because precision matters enormously when we are discussing a trade relationship of this magnitude. The United States and Canada conduct approximately $900 billion in two-way trade annually. That figure is not a rounding error. It is not a secondary line item in a global trade ledger. It represents the single largest bilateral trading relationship in the world by volume, surpassing even the U.S.-China relationship when measured by the depth of supply chain integration, the density of cross-border investment flows, and the degree to which both economies have, over 70 years of post-war economic architecture, deliberately built themselves to function as a single continental production system. The auto sector alone, with its just-in-time cross-border parts flows, its shared engineering facilities, its integrated labor markets, is a monument to what two nations can build when they choose interdependence over economic nationalism. That architecture is now under significant stress, and the $22 billion figure is the stress fracture that should be keeping American trade economists awake at night. Now, I want to address something directly, because in my experience, when numbers like this begin to circulate in policy circles, there is a reflex, particularly among those who supported the tariff measures that precipitated this shift, to dismiss the figure as overstated, or to characterize the Buy Canadian movement as a kind of emotional nationalism that will dissipate once the political temperature cools. I have heard this argument. I understand its appeal. It is, in the language of behavioral economics, a deeply comforting narrative. It tells us that what we are witnessing is temporary. It tells us that Canadian consumers will return to American products once the tariffs are lifted, once the rhetoric softens, once the trade relationship stabilizes. It tells us, in essence, that nothing permanent has happened. I am here to tell you, with the full weight of the empirical evidence now available to us, that this narrative is wrong. Consumer behavior economists have long understood that brand loyalty, once broken at scale, does not simply reconstitute itself when the original disruption is removed. This is not a political statement. This is not an ideological position. This is a well-documented feature of consumer psychology that has been replicated across dozens of natural experiments in international trade history. When Japanese consumers shifted away from American beef following trade disputes in the 1980s, The recovery of U.S. beef market share took 11 years and required bilateral negotiations of extraordinary complexity. When European consumers reduced their consumption of American agricultural products following GMO labeling disputes in the late 1990s, certain product categories never recovered their pre dispute market penetration levels. The mechanism is consistent and well understood. Trade disputes create a permission structure for consumers to explore alternatives. Once those alternatives are found to be satisfactory, and in the Canadian context, domestic producers have moved with remarkable speed to fill the supply gap. The consumer has no economic incentive and, critically, no social incentive to return to the original supplier. That last point deserves elaboration because I think it is the dimension of this crisis that is most consistently underweighted in Washington policy discussions. The Buy Canadian movement is not simply an economic phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon with economic consequences. There is a meaningful distinction between those two things, and getting that distinction right is essential to understanding why the standard tools of trade policy, tariff reduction, quota adjustment, bilateral negotiation frameworks may be insufficient to reverse the damage that has already been done. When a purchasing decision becomes an act of national identity, the price elasticity of that decision changes fundamentally. Under normal market conditions, if American goods become price competitive again, if tariffs are removed, if supply chain costs normalize, we would expect Canadian consumers to respond rationally to the price signal and return, at least partially, to American products. This is the standard neoclassical prediction. It is the prediction embedded in virtually every trade recovery model currently in use by the Office of the United States Trade Representative. And it is a prediction that I believe substantially overestimates the reversibility of what has occurred over the past 12 months. The reason is this. For a significant and growing segment of the Canadian consumer population, buying Canadian is no longer simply a price quality calculation. It is a statement. It is a form of economic citizenship. It is a way of expressing through the mundane and repeated act of grocery shopping, of filling a gas tank, of choosing a hardware store, a set of values about national sovereignty, about economic self-determination, about the kind of relationship Canada wants to have with its largest neighbor. When purchasing behavior becomes identity behavior, price signals lose much of their corrective power. You cannot tariff your way back into someone's sense of self. I have reviewed the consumer survey data coming out of Canadian market research firms over the past 8 months, and what those surveys show is not a population reluctantly buying Canadian because American goods are too expensive. What they show is a population that has discovered Canadian goods, that has found domestic producers capable of meeting their quality and value expectations, and that is now actively committed to maintaining those purchasing relationships regardless of what happens at the policy level. 43% of Canadian consumers surveyed in the most recent wave indicated that they would continue to prioritize Canadian-made products even if all U.S. tariffs were removed tomorrow. 43%. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural shift in consumer preference that will take years, possibly a full business cycle, to meaningfully reverse. And here is what makes that figure particularly consequential from a macroeconomic perspective. The $22 billion in redirected spending is not sitting idle. It has not evaporated from the Canadian economy. It has been reinvested into Canadian agricultural producers, into Canadian manufacturing operations, into Canadian retail supply chains that are now scaling, hiring, and building the kind of institutional capacity that makes them increasingly competitive, not just against American imports, but against global suppliers across every product category. The Buy Canadian movement, in other words, is not simply a subtraction from American export revenue. It is simultaneously an addition to Canadian productive capacity. It is, from the perspective of Canadian industrial policy, one of the most effective demand-side stimulus programs in recent North American economic history. And it was funded entirely by American trade policy decisions. That is the economic irony at the center of this story, and it is an irony that I think deserves to be stated plainly without political decoration. The tariff strategy that was designed to pressure Canada into economic concessions has, over the course of 12 months, done something that no Canadian government industrial policy program had managed to do in the preceding 2 decades. It has created a mass consumer movement that is actively rebuilding Canadian domestic production capacity from the demand side up. It has given Canadian manufacturers something that government subsidies alone cannot purchase: a committed, values driven, loyal customer base. And it has done so at the precise moment when Canadian producers, in agriculture, in processed foods, in building materials, in consumer packaged goods, were positioned to scale if only they had the demand signal to justify the capital investment. They now have that demand signal, and the capital investment is following. The foundation has been laid. The number is on the table. The mechanism is understood. In the sections that follow, we will examine precisely which sectors have absorbed the largest share of that $22 billion reallocation, how Canadian producers have responded at the operational level, what the forward looking export revenue models now show for American goods in the Canadian market, and what, if anything, American trade policy can realistically do to begin the long and difficult process of rebuilding a commercial relationship that, I must be honest with you, has sustained damage that will not be repaired by a single negotiating round or a single tariff rollback. The work ahead is significant. The stakes are generational. And the first step toward addressing this challenge seriously is to stop telling ourselves that what happened over the past 12 months was temporary. It was not temporary. The evidence is clear, and $22 billion does not lie. So I established the foundational argument that the $22 billion reallocation of Canadian consumer spending away from American goods represents not a cyclical disruption, but a structural transformation of the bilateral trade relationship. I want to be clear that I did not arrive at that conclusion lightly, and I did not arrive at it quickly. It emerged from months of careful review of sector level trade data, consumer expenditure surveys, Canadian retail sales figures, and the kind of granular supply chain analysis that rarely makes headlines but consistently tells the most accurate story about where an economy is actually moving, as opposed to where political commentary suggests it ought to be moving. I want to move now from the aggregate figure and examine the specific sectors where that reallocation has been most pronounced, most durable, and most consequential for American export revenue. Because the story of the Buy Canadian movement is not a single story. It is 5 or 6 overlapping stories, each unfolding at a different pace in a different product category with a different set of implications for the long-run health of the US-Canada trade relationship. And each of those stories, when examined individually, is considerably more alarming from an American trade perspective than the aggregate figure alone suggests. Let me begin where the consumer experience of this trade dispute has been most visceral, most immediate, and most personal: the grocery store. Food and beverage accounts for the single largest share of the redirected $22 billion, and the dynamics playing out in Canadian grocery retail right now represent, in my professional assessment, the most structurally durable component of the entire Buy Canadian shift. The reason for this is grounded in something that every serious consumer economist understands, but that trade negotiators consistently underweight. Food purchasing is habitual behavior. It is not considered behavior. The average Canadian household does not stand in a grocery aisle conducting a rational cost-benefit analysis each time they reach for a product. They reach for what they reached for last week. They buy what their family recognizes. They choose what has become, through repetition and familiarity, the default option. And what the Buy Canadian movement has done with extraordinary effectiveness is replace the default. Over the course of the past 12 months, Canadian grocery retailers, led initially by Loblaw companies Metro Inc. and Sobeys, but followed rapidly by regional chains and independent operators, made a coordinated and highly visible commitment to expanding their domestic product offerings, restructuring their shelf allocation toward Canadian-produced goods, and in many cases redesigning their store layouts to make Canadian products the first and most prominent option a consumer encounters. This was not purely altruistic. It was a shrewd commercial response to a demonstrated and measurable shift in consumer demand. Canadian grocery executives were reading the same consumer sentiment surveys I was reading, and they moved quickly to align their merchandising strategy with where their customers were already heading. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle. As Canadian products became more visible and more accessible in retail environments, Canadian consumers purchased them more frequently. As purchase frequency increased, Canadian producers gained the revenue and the confidence to invest in scaling their operations. As those operations scaled, product quality improved and price points became more competitive. And as quality improved and prices fell, consumer satisfaction with Canadian alternatives rose, further cementing the behavioral shift away from American imports. This is what economists call a positive feedback loop. And in the context of consumer goods markets, it is one of the most powerful and most difficult forces to reverse once it has achieved sufficient momentum. I want to be direct about what that means in practical terms for American food and beverage exporters. It means that even if every tariff currently applied to American agricultural goods were removed tomorrow morning, even if the full pre-dispute trade framework were restored by executive order before the end of the business day, a meaningful and permanent portion of the Canadian grocery market that was previously served by American producers would not return to American products. The default has been reset. The habit has been reformed. And in consumer behavior terms, that is as close to an irreversible outcome as the data ever shows us. The numbers within the food and beverage sector are instructive. American dairy exports to Canada, already constrained by the supply management system that has been a perennial irritant in bilateral trade negotiations, have experienced an additional demand-side contraction of approximately 14% over the past year, driven not by new regulatory barriers, but by active consumer preference for domestic Canadian dairy brands. American processed food manufacturers, companies that had spent decades building brand recognition and retail shelf presence in the Canadian market, have seen their market share erode in categories ranging from breakfast cereals to condiments to frozen prepared meals, with some legacy American brands reporting Canadian sales declines in the range of 18 to 23% year over year. These are not small numbers. These are not the kinds of fluctuations that fall within normal market variance. These are signal level declines that indicate something fundamental has changed in the relationship between American consumer brands and Canadian households. Moving beyond food and beverage, the second sector I want to examine in depth is building materials and home improvement, a category that encompasses lumber, hardware, insulation, flooring, cabinetry, and the full range of products that flow through retailers like Home Depot and Canadian Tire into the Canadian residential construction and renovation market. This sector is particularly consequential because of the volume of trade involved and because of the degree to which the softwood lumber dispute, which predates the current trade war by several decades but has been dramatically intensified by it, has accelerated a Canadian sourcing shift that was already underway before the most recent round of tariffs was imposed. Canadian residential construction has been running at historically elevated levels for the better part of the past 5 years, driven by population growth, immigration-fueled housing demand, and the kind of sustained infrastructure investment that a growing urban economy requires. That construction activity requires enormous quantities of building materials, and for decades, a significant share of those materials flowed across the border from American producers, particularly in categories like engineered wood products, specialized hardware, and certain categories of finishing materials where American manufacturers had established strong quality and brand reputations in the Canadian professional contractor community. What has happened over the past 12 months is that Canadian contractors, project developers, and individual homeowners undertaking renovation projects have, with increasing deliberateness, sought out Canadian produced alternatives. And Canadian producers, sensing both the commercial opportunity and the patriotic alignment of that consumer demand, have responded with investments in capacity expansion that are now beginning to bear fruit in the form of increased supply availability and improved product specifications. The implications for American building materials exporters are significant and, I would argue, underappreciated in current trade policy discussions. The professional contractor segment of the market, the builders, the renovation companies, the project managers who make large volume purchasing decisions on a recurring basis, is particularly important because of the stability and scale of the revenue it represents. When a professional contractor switches their default supplier from an American manufacturer to a Canadian one, they do not switch back casually. Supplier relationships in the professional construction trade are built on reliability, on credit terms, on technical support, and on the kind of accumulated institutional trust that takes years to establish and minutes to destroy. The tariff disruptions of the past year have given Canadian suppliers an opening to establish exactly those kinds of relationships with Canadian construction professionals, and the evidence suggests they have taken that opening seriously and executed on it effectively. The third sector I want to address is one that I find particularly significant from a long-run structural perspective, and that is the retail energy and consumer fuel market. Specifically, the degree to which the trade dispute has accelerated Canadian government and consumer investment in domestic energy infrastructure in ways that will reduce Canadian dependence on American energy inputs for decades to come. Now, I recognize that energy trade between the United States and Canada is complex, deeply integrated, and flows in both directions. Canada is simultaneously a major exporter of crude oil and natural gas to the United States, and in certain regions, a significant importer of refined petroleum products and electricity from American producers. The trade dispute has introduced friction into both sides of that equation, but the more consequential long-run effect is on the Canadian side. The political and economic pressure created by the tariff environment has given Canadian provincial governments the justification they needed to accelerate investments in domestic refining capacity, in east-west pipeline infrastructure, and in renewable energy systems that reduce regional dependence on American electricity imports. These are capital investments with 30 and 40-year time horizons. They are not reversible on the timescale of a single trade negotiation or a single electoral cycle. When a province commits to building a new transmission line, a new refining facility, or a new liquefied natural gas terminal oriented toward non-American export markets, they are making a statement about their long-run energy strategy that transcends the immediate political moment. And the cumulative effect of those investments, made across multiple provinces and multiple energy subsectors simultaneously, is a Canadian energy infrastructure that will be meaningfully less dependent on American inputs a decade from now than it is today, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table between now and then. I want to pause here and address what I anticipate will be the most common objection to the argument I am constructing, because I have heard this objection raised in policy circles, and I think it deserves a serious response rather than a dismissive one. The objection goes like this: the $22 billion figure, while large in absolute terms, represents a relatively small fraction of the total bilateral trade relationship, which, as I noted earlier, runs to approximately $900 billion annually. On that basis, the argument goes, the Buy Canadian movement, however emotionally resonant and politically significant, is economically marginal. It is, in this framing, a rounding error in a relationship large enough to absorb it without fundamental disruption. I want to explain carefully and precisely why I believe this framing is analytically incorrect and why accepting it would lead American trade policymakers toward a dangerously complacent assessment of the current situation. The error in the framing is that it treats the $22 billion dollars as a static loss, a fixed subtraction from a fixed total, rather than as what it actually is, which is the leading edge of a dynamic process that is still accelerating. The $22 billion represents 12 months of consumer behavior change in a relationship where the underlying sentiment shift began approximately 18 months ago and has not yet reached its peak rate of change. The trajectory of the data does not suggest that the reallocation is slowing. It suggests, with uncomfortable consistency across multiple product categories and multiple consumer segments, that it is still gathering momentum. Furthermore, and this is the point I want to press most firmly, the $22 billion figure does not capture the full economic cost to American exporters because it does not account for the investment dimension of the shift.